The chain link clattered to the ground at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and Michael Torres knew before he even looked out the window. The metallic scraping, the triumphant laugh, the sound of wire cutters hitting concrete, it was happening again. The 42-year-old civil litigation attorney stood at his kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, watching his neighbor Linda Fairweather methodically destroy the fence section he'd just had repaired 3 days ago. Sunlight glinted off the industrial cutters in her manicured hands as she worked, her white tennis outfit pristine against the carnage she was creating. 4 months of this. 4 months of cut fences, poisoned landscaping, and a woman who seemed to believe that property lines were merely suggestions for people beneath her tax bracket. But this morning was different. This morning, Michael wasn't calling the police again. He was documenting. And what Linda didn't know was that the exhausted attorney she'd been tormenting had spent the last 6 weeks building a case that would make his closing arguments in federal court look like practice runs. Before we dive into how Michael turned a fence-cutting neighbor into a cautionary tale about property law, if you love stories where justice is served and entitled people finally meet their match, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a reasonable man past his breaking point. The confrontation where decades of legal experience collided with suburban entitlement. And the resolution where a courtroom became the stage. For the most satisfying property dispute this county had ever witnessed. The first part takes us through Michael's descent from diplomatic neighbor to someone who realized that being nice had only encouraged a predator. Watch how 4 months of escalating destruction systematically dismantled his faith in neighborly resolution, how each police visit resulted in nothing but shrugged shoulders and vague promises, how his attempts at peace were met with sneering contempt and increasingly brazen acts of property destruction. The violation wasn't just about cut fences. It was about the systematic erosion of a person's sense of safety in their own home. The second part brings us to the moment power shifted completely. Michael had stopped being a victim and started being what he was trained to be, a litigator who prepared cases like military campaigns. You'll see the confrontation where Linda's smug confidence shattered against the reality of what she'd actually done, legally speaking, and how Michael's calm recitation of statutes and case law transformed a property dispute into something far more serious. The third part delivers the courtroom drama, where a small claims case became a masterclass in consequences, where a judge who'd seen too many entitled defendants finally had the evidence to make an example, and where Michael's meticulously documented case created ripple effects Linda never saw coming. Here's exactly how it happened. Michael Torres had bought the 3-bedroom ranch house on Oakmont Drive in March, 2 months after his divorce finalized and 3 weeks before he made partner at Brennan & Associates. The civil litigation firm specialized in property disputes, contract law, and the kind of tedious documentation that most people found mind-numbing, but Michael found meditative. At 42, with silver threading through his dark hair and permanent shadows under his eyes from too many late-night case preparations, he'd wanted nothing more than a quiet place to rebuild. The house had a small backyard with an above-ground pool, mature oak trees that provided shade, and neighbors who'd seemed pleasant enough during the walkthrough. He worked 60-hour weeks, spent weekends with his 2 teenage daughters, and bothered absolutely no one. The pool had been the selling point for his girls, Emma, 16, and Sophie, 14, who split time between his place and their mother's condo across town. Michael had spent his first weekend installing proper fencing around the pool area, not just for safety, but because the property line between his yard and Linda Fairweather's adjacent lot had always been poorly defined. The previous owners had apparently operated on a handshake agreement about boundaries. Michael preferred clear lines. The first incident happened in early May, 6 weeks after he'd moved in. Michael had arrived home from work at 7:30 p.m. to find a 3-foot section of his new fence cleanly cut, the severed chain link peeled back like someone had opened a can. His first thought was teenagers, maybe vandalism, though it seemed oddly surgical for random destruction. The cut was precise, purposeful, creating a walkway-sized opening directly from Linda's manicured lawn into his pool area. He'd noticed Linda before. Hard to miss her, really. She was in her late 50s, with blonde hair maintained at considerable expense and a wardrobe that suggested someone who'd never worked a day in her life, but had opinions about those who did. Her husband traveled constantly for business, leaving her alone in the oversized colonial next door with nothing but time and a simmering resentment toward anyone she deemed beneath her social station. Michael had repaired the fence that weekend, assuming it was a one-time thing, maybe even an accident involving lawn equipment. He was wrong. 3 weeks later, he found another section cut, this time with a note zip-tied to the severed fence. The paper, written in aggressive block letters, read, "This fence is blocking my view of my trees. Remove it." Michael had stood there, note in hand, genuinely confused. The fence was 6 feet inside his property line, confirmed by the survey he'd paid for during closing. It blocked nothing except Linda's apparent desire to treat his yard as an extension of hers. He'd knocked on her door that evening, polite and reasonable, survey documentation in hand. Linda had answered in a silk robe, martini glass in hand, and looked at him like he was a door-to-door salesman. When he'd explained the situation, shown her the survey, asked her to please stop damaging his property, she'd laughed. Actually laughed. "Your fence is an eyesore that diminishes my property value," she'd said, swirling her drink. "I don't care what your little papers say. This is a nice neighborhood and we have standards." She'd closed the door in his face before he could respond. The third incident was when Michael realized he wasn't dealing with ignorance or misunderstanding. He was dealing with someone who genuinely believed rules didn't apply to her. He'd come home in late June to find not just cut fencing, but his pool's filtration system dismantled, chemicals poured into his garden beds, and his patio furniture shoved into the pool. Linda had been standing in her yard, watching his garage door open, waiting for his reaction. When their eyes met, she'd smiled and raised her wine glass in mock salute. Michael had called the police. The responding officer, a young patrolman named Davidson, had taken notes, looked uncomfortable, and explained that without direct proof of who'd done it, and since it was a property dispute between neighbors, maybe they should both try to work it out like adults. Linda had come to her fence line during the officer's visit, expressed shock and concern about the vandalism, suggested that maybe Michael had teenage daughters who were acting out about the divorce. The officer had actually nodded along, as if that made sense. Michael had filed a report anyway, knowing it would go nowhere, feeling his faith in simple solutions dying by degrees. Michael had spent the next 2 weeks not calling the police, not confronting Linda, not doing anything except what he did best, building a case. He'd installed 6 security cameras with night vision, positioned to cover every angle of his property. He'd documented every previous incident with photographs, timestamps, police report numbers, and repair receipts. He'd pulled property records, researched Linda's history, and discovered she'd had disputes with the previous homeowner, too. Disputes that had ended with the previous owner moving away rather than fighting. He'd found the pattern, the history, the evidence of someone who'd learned that most people eventually gave up. Michael didn't give up. He prepared. And on the morning of July 16th, when Linda Fairweather walked into his yard with wire cutters, at 9:15 a.m., every camera was recording in high definition, and Michael was finally completely ready. Linda had just finished cutting through the fourth fence post when Michael stepped out his back door. She didn't startle, didn't try to hide the cutters, didn't even look particularly concerned. She'd done this enough times now that she'd grown comfortable with the routine. Destroy property, deny involvement, watch him realize no one would help. But this time, Michael wasn't holding a phone to call police. He was holding a folder, his expression calm, almost pleasant. "Good morning, Linda," he said, his courtroom voice smooth and professional. "I'm glad you're making this easy." She turned, cutters still in hand, and smirked. "Your fence is still an eyesore, Michael. I've asked you nicely to remove it." The irony of calling destruction asking nicely seemed lost on her. Michael smiled, opened his folder, and began to read. Linda Marie Fairweather, 58, residing at 1247 Oakmont Drive. Married to Robert Fairweather, Senior VP at Hastings Pharmaceuticals, currently in Singapore for business. Previous address, Willowbrook Estates, where you had similar disputes with 3 separate neighbors before your husband's company relocated you here. Linda's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered. "So you can use Google. Congratulations." "Let me continue," Michael said, his voice never rising, never showing emotion. June 2nd, 7:45 p.m. You cut Section 3A of my fence while I was at my daughter Emma's volleyball game at Riverside High School. I have time-stamped photos from the game, security footage from my cameras, and a neighbor's Ring doorbell that captured you walking back to your house with wire cutters. June 23rd, 3:30 p.m., you cut Section 2B and left the note, which has your fingerprints on it. I had it processed privately. July 3rd, 6:15 p.m., you dismantled my pool equipment and vandalized my garden while I was at a work dinner at Morton's Steakhouse. I have the receipt. The security footage and my lawn service can testify about the condition of the garden beds before and after. This morning, July 16th, 9:15 a.m., you've cut 4 fence posts while being recorded by 6 different camera angles. He pulled out a thick stack of printed photos, each labeled with date, time, and clear images of Linda in the act. Her face had gone pale, the wire cutters slipping slightly in her hands. Michael continued, consulting his notes like he was reading a deposition. "I've also pulled the records from Willowbrook Estates. Mrs. Patricia Chen, your former neighbor, filed 3 police reports against you for property destruction before dropping them. Mr. James Wheeler moved rather than pursue charges after you damaged his deck. The Hendersons paid for mediation that went nowhere because your husband's company's legal team made it expensive for them to fight. You have a pattern of targeting people you think won't fight back, people who value peace over justice, people who'll eventually just give up and move away." Linda's smirk was completely gone now, replaced by something closer to calculation, trying to figure out how serious this was, whether this was just intimidation or an actual threat. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "You're a lawyer. You know how expensive litigation is. You really want to take me to court over a fence?" Michael closed the folder slowly, deliberately. "Linda, I don't practice criminal law, but I have friends who do. What you've done over the past 4 months constitutes criminal mischief, criminal trespassing, malicious destruction of property, and depending on how the prosecutor feels, possibly stalking, given the pattern and targeting. The criminal charges would be filed by the county. The civil suit for damages, emotional distress, and legal fees, that one's mine. And unlike your previous neighbors, I actually enjoy litigation. It's literally what I do for a living." He paused, letting that sink in. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm giving you one choice, one time. Option 1, I file charges this afternoon. Criminal charges for all 4 incidents, with complete documentation. I sue you in civil court for actual damages, approximately $8,000 in repairs and replacements, plus punitive damages, which in property destruction cases with patterns of harassment can run 3 to 5 times actual damages. I post the security footage online with appropriate context. Your husband's company's legal team can't make this go away because I'm not intimidated by corporate lawyers, and my firm has more experience in property litigation than whatever they'll send. This will be expensive, public, and permanent on your record. Option 2, Michael continued, his tone never changing from professional courtesy. You pay for every single repair. $8,000 certified check by 5 p.m. today. You sign a witnessed agreement that you'll never set foot on my property again, never damage my property again, never contact me except through your attorney if absolutely necessary. You sell this house and move within 6 months. I don't care where, but you don't stay next door to me. You do all of this quietly and completely, and I don't file anything. You get to keep your clean record. Your husband never has to explain to his bosses why his wife is facing criminal charges, and this ends today. Linda's hands were shaking now, the wire cutters finally dropping to the ground. You can't force me to sell my house. That's insane. Michael smiled, and it wasn't friendly. I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm giving you options. If you choose option 1, the criminal record and civil judgment will make living next to me uncomfortable enough that you'll want to move anyway. This way is cleaner for everyone. But Linda, and I need you to understand this clearly, I am done being nice. I am done being reasonable. I am done pretending that your behavior is acceptable because conflict makes people uncomfortable. You've spent 4 months making my life miserable because you thought I wouldn't fight back. You were wrong. The silence stretched between them, broken only by suburban sounds, distant lawnmower, birds, a dog barking somewhere. Linda bent slowly, picked up her wire cutters, and for a moment Michael wondered if she was going to try to brazen it out, call his bluff, force him to actually follow through. Then she spoke, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. I'll need to talk to my husband. Michael shook his head. No, Robert is in Singapore. By the time he's available, my deadline will have passed, and I'll have filed. You decide now, Linda, right now. Do you want this to be over quietly? Or do you want this to become the most expensive fence you've ever touched? Linda looked at her house, at his fence, at the folder in his hands that contained evidence of every moment she'd thought she was untouchable. I'll pay, she whispered. I'll sign whatever. I'll move. Michael nodded once. My attorney will have the paperwork ready by 2 p.m. You'll sign it at his office with witnesses. The check will be certified. And Linda, if you try to retaliate, if you try to make this difficult, if you do anything except exactly what we've agreed, I'll still file everything. The only thing keeping you out of court right now is your complete cooperation. Do you understand? She nodded, turned, and walked back toward her house, the wire cutters hanging limply at her side. Michael watched her go, then looked down at his destroyed fence, and smiled for the first time in months. The certified check cleared at 5:47 p.m. that evening, and by 6 p.m. Linda had signed the agreement in front of Michael's attorney, Jeremy Chen, and 2 witnesses from the firm. The document was airtight. Michael had drafted it himself, with the kind of precision that made Jeremy whistle low and say, "Remind me never to piss you off." Linda had barely looked at anyone. Signing with shaking hands, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The agreement included specific damages for each incident, a restraining order clause that would activate if she violated any terms, and the 6-month sale deadline with proof of listing requirements. Michael had made it so comprehensive that any violation would be instantly documentable and actionable. Linda had left the office without speaking, and Michael had gone home to finally repair his fence properly, knowing this time it would stay fixed. But Linda, it turned out, couldn't help herself. 3 days later, Michael's cameras caught her in his yard at 11 p.m., spray painting obscenities on his pool shed. She was drunk, angry, and apparently convinced that she could get away with one last act of defiance. Michael had the police there in 8 minutes, the footage already queued up on his phone, the signed agreement in his hand showing that she was now in violation of a legal contract in addition to trespassing. Officer Davidson, the same patrolman who'd been unhelpful the first time, had looked at the evidence, looked at Linda stumbling and slurring in her bathrobe, and called for backup. This time there were no suggestions about working it out like adults. This time Linda was arrested, charged with criminal trespassing, vandalism, and violation of a legal agreement. Robert Fairweather had flown back from Singapore 2 days later, looking exhausted and furious, and had personally apologized to Michael before hiring 3 different attorneys. But the damage was done, literally and legally. The criminal charges stuck because the evidence was overwhelming. Linda pled out to avoid trial, accepting supervised probation, mandatory community service, and a fine. The civil agreement held, which meant she still had to move. And because she'd violated the agreement, Michael filed for punitive damages on top of the original amount, which a judge granted without hesitation given the pattern of behavior. The real reckoning came in early September, at what should have been a simple hearing about the damages. Linda's attorney had tried to argue that she'd already paid, that Michael was being vindictive, that the additional punitive damages were excessive. Judge Patricia Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd presided over property disputes for 20 years, had listened to 5 minutes of arguments before asking to see Michael's evidence. He'd provided everything: the timeline, the security footage, the previous neighbor's testimony he'd collected, the agreement, the violation, the arrest. Judge Morrison had watched the spray painting footage twice, read through the previous incidents, and then looked at Linda with an expression that made everyone in the courtroom go quiet. "Mrs. Fairweather," the judge had said, her voice cold, "in 20 years on this bench, I have never seen such a clear case of someone who believes they are above consequences. You systematically destroyed your neighbor's property. When given a generous opportunity to make it right without criminal charges, you violated that agreement within 3 days. You thought you could do whatever you wanted because your husband has money and connections, because you've bullied previous neighbors into moving rather than fighting, because you've never actually faced consequences before." Linda had tried to speak, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. "I'm going to give you consequences now." The judgment was brutal and specific. Linda had to pay the original $8,000 in damages, plus $25,000 in punitive damages, plus Michael's attorney fees of $12,000. She had to complete 200 hours of community service at a property restoration nonprofit, essentially repairing other people's property since she'd been so eager to destroy Michael's. The house had to be listed for sale within 30 days, and she was banned from any contact with Michael for 5 years. Judge Morrison had also made a note in the court record about Linda's pattern of behavior, which meant any future property disputes would show this judgment immediately. It was the legal equivalent of a permanent warning label. Linda's attorney had looked shell-shocked. Robert Fairweather had put his head in his hands, and Michael had simply nodded, watching justice finally, comprehensively served. The best part had come last, when Judge Morrison had asked Michael if he was satisfied with the judgment. He'd stood, straightened his tie, and said simply, "Your Honor, I'm an attorney. I'm satisfied when the law works exactly as it's supposed to. Thank you." The judge had actually smiled. 2 months later, Michael sat on his repaired patio, watching Emma and Sophie swim in the pool that had caused so much trouble. The fence was reinforced now, professionally installed with concrete posts that would take serious equipment to damage. The Fairweather house next door had a sold sign out front. They'd listed after 3 weeks and accepted the first offer, apparently eager to leave. New neighbors were moving in next week, a young couple with a baby who'd seemed delighted by the quiet street and friendly wave Michael had given them during their walkthrough. His security cameras were still up, still recording, because Michael had learned that documentation was the difference between being a victim and being prepared. But he didn't check them obsessively anymore. The lawn service had restored his garden beds better than before. The pool equipment hummed efficiently. And for the first time since he'd bought this house, Michael felt like it was actually his, not just a battlefield where he'd had to defend his basic right to peace. Emma climbed out of the pool, wrapped in a towel, and sat beside him. "Dad, did you really make that lady move away because she cut our fence?" Michael considered the question, thought about explaining property law and evidence collection and the satisfaction of a well-built case, but settled for simpler truth. "I made her face consequences for her actions. That's all anyone can really do." Sophie called from the pool for Emma to come back in, and as his daughter ran off laughing, Michael leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and smiled. He'd learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from hoping someone else will fix your problems. Sometimes it comes from being prepared, being thorough, and refusing to accept that being nice means being a doormat. The fence was fixed, the case was closed. And as the sun set over his quiet backyard, Michael realized that justice, whether delivered in a courtroom or in a certified check and a moving truck, was equally satisfying when you'd earned it yourself. Across the country in Portland, Oregon, a retired federal prosecutor named Diana Alvarez stood in her driveway staring at the custom motorcycle her HOA president had just demanded she remove from her garage. The bike wasn't even visible from the street, but Trevor Markham insisted it violated some aesthetic covenant he'd apparently invented that morning. Diana smiled, the same smile that had once preceded devastating cross-examinations in federal court, and pulled out her phone to show Trevor the incorporation documents for their HOA, which she'd requested from the county last week. Turned out the HOA had never been properly registered, which meant, legally speaking, it didn't actually exist. "Please," she said quietly, "keep making demands. I'd love to explain property law to someone who thinks a clipboard makes them powerful." Trevor went pale. "But that's a story for another time."